But the rationalist, of course, disagrees. The rationalist says, no, there are things like that. So let's take a look at some synthetic a priori truths according to the rationalist tradition. The empiricist, notice, has to say every one of these is either true purely by virtue of meaning or is something true on the basis of experience and knowable only through experience. But the rationalist says no, I can know these things simply by reflection, reason alone, without experience, but also they go beyond merely verbal truths, they're really about the world. So here are some examples from the Islamic philosopher Avicenna. The whole is greater than its parts. Things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. In Descartes, I think, I am. He proposes those as things that are synthetic. They're really about existence, they're not just verbal. But on the other hand, I don't need experience of the world, I just need to think to recognize their truth. In fact, anyone who thinks must exist while thinking. Nothing's made from nothing, Descartes says. It's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time. What's been done can't be undone. There was a significant debate around the middle of the 20th century about things very much like Descartes' idea, it's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time. The question was whether something could be entirely red and entirely green, all over, at once. Well, as soon as we imagined that, we realized, no, that couldn't happen. Something couldn't be all red and all green. It's connected to a sort of riddle that was popular at the time. What's black and white and red all over? Answer is a newspaper. Red here, not R-E-D, but R-E-A-D. Kind of a bad joke. There were variants on it at the time, I remember from my childhood. What's black and white and red all over a sunburned zebra? But anyway, whether that inspired the philosophical debate or whether the philosophical debate inspired that kind of riddle, I'm not sure. However, the idea was simply, could something be black and white all over? Not partly black and partly white, but black all over and white all over. Could something be red all over and green all over? Well, let's agree that it can't be. What kind of truth is that? Is it a truth about the world or is it a truth about language? Well, it seems awkward to call it a truth about language. I mean, what the meaning of red and green entails that they are incompatible and the same thing couldn't be entirely one and entirely other. It seems odd. I mean, I don't know how to define red or green, but it would be weird that the meanings of the terms themselves determine that, and it's hard to explain how that could be. But on the other hand, if it's a truth about the world, it seems to be a fundamental truth about the world, one that I can just come to by trying to imagine the situation and realizing it's inconceivable. I can't imagine it. That doesn't really require perception or experience of the world. I don't paint things red and then try and experiment with it. Well, now let's paint them entirely green and see if they're both red and green all over. I don't have to. I just try to imagine it. I can't imagine it. And so the rationalist says that's a good example of a synthetic a priori truth. I can derive that just by a feat of imagination, a sort of thought experiment where I think, is that possible? And immediately I think, no. But notice there, I'm reflecting on something about my ability to imagine a scenario. I am not gaining experience of the world, but neither am I simply reflecting on the meanings of terms. I'm not thinking about language. Leibniz proposes a fundamental principle as a synthetic a priori truth, which he calls the principle of sufficient reason. There can be no fact without a sufficient reason why it should be so and not otherwise. Immanuel Kant proposes a variety of these. Every event has a cause, for example, closely related to that principle of sufficient reason. He says all truths of mathematics are like this. 7 plus 5 is 12 is the example he gives. And geometry, being between any 2 points, lies one and only one line. He says those are things that are truths about the world. They were in fact necessary truths about the world. They aren't derived from experience. I don't write down 2 points and then try drawing lines between them to figure out that between any 2 points lies one line. That's something, again, I can do purely as an act of imagination. I can do it as a thought experiment. I don't need real experience of the world. But on the other hand, I can't also understand this simply by thinking, well, what is a point? What is a line? What does the word line mean? It's not a verbal truth, but neither is it something derived from experience. It's synthetic and a priori, Kant says. And the same thing is true with truths of arithmetic, he claims, like 7 plus 5 is 12. Now, you might think at first glance, oh, wait, that doesn't feel as if it's really about the world. It doesn't feel as if it's something that, I mean, the a priori, I'll grant you, I don't have to do experiments here. But on the other hand, it seems like, wait, surely this is an analytic truth. And indeed, that's how Descartes and a variety of empiricists have seen it. But Kant argues this way. He says, look, you've got 7 things, and then you add 5 things together. You're taking a set of 5 and a set of 7, and now you're combining them. So here's how you might think about what's going on here. He says, I've got 5 things. Okay, so that's something like a unit. Now I've got 7 things. That's a unit. And now I say, add them together. They form this other unit of 12 things. In set theory, we would say the underlying principle is that the union of any 2 sets is a set. Well, that is why Kant is saying, this feels synthetic a priori to me. It's something that is truly a priori. I don't need to do experiments. I don't need to start laying out matchsticks or pieces of chalk and counting them and so forth. It's something I can do in my own mind, but it looks like it's not analytic either. It's not derivable merely by the meanings of addition and 5 and 7 and 12. Why? Because there's an underlying principle, something like this principle, that the union of any 2 sets is a set. And what's that? How do I know that if I've got one collection here and another collection here, I can combine them and form a larger collection? Is that part of the meaning of set or collection? Is it part of the meaning of union? I don't know how to define those things in such a way that I can explain that. And so Kant says that's a good example of something that is synthetic. It's not something that I can derive merely by the meanings of terms, but on the other hand, it's a priori. I can get it from a thought experiment, from reason alone. It doesn't require experience of the world. Well, once you grant the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments, you can get many other possibilities, and medieval philosophers exploited that. Of course, it's not just the medieval philosophers. Descartes exploits that. Leibniz exploits that. And they derive all sorts of things they take to be exciting philosophical propositions that have this character of being synthetic and a priori. So, for example, in theology, God exists, or the soul is immortal. In metaphysics in general, the world consists of substances and their attributes, something that Aristotle would have loved. The will is free, or every substance has an essence. Those Aristotelian ideas, or in the case of the freedom of the will, something that has been debated for centuries, even going back to ancient times, those are things that people have taken to be derivable independently of experience, just from reflection through reason alone, but nevertheless really be truths about the world, not merely verbal. And in ethics, you ought to seek the good. Happiness is intrinsically good. Courage is a virtue. And many, many other truths of ethics. It's hard to say how we're devising or deriving any of these things from experience. It looks like the idea that happiness is a good thing isn't something I have to learn from experience. On the other hand, it's not purely a verbal truth. And so all sorts of claims about ethics also seem to be like this. So the rationalist is going to say, actually, a lot of things fall into this category of synthetic a priori truths. Now, the empiricist has to do something about them, categorize them in this way or categorize them in that way, and sometimes that might seem plausible. The whole is greater than the parts. You could say that's part of that just follows from the definitions of whole and part. But you ought to seek the good, for example. It doesn't feel like that's merely a verbal truth, though maybe it is. Maybe it's somehow built into the meaning of good and ought. And so there's a lot to debate with respect to every single one of those kinds of examples. Here's the key points, though. The rationalist says a huge amount of knowledge is coming purely from the mind. Of course, from the mind together with perception, but a significant portion, and the philosophically exciting portions, are coming from the mind alone, independently of experience. We're born with that knowledge. It's there as part of us, hardwired in from the very beginning.